Hello, beautiful listener. Happy Halloween. After a month of scary stories, I thought it would be nice to read something a little less terrifying today. I found a vintage children's story about Halloween, which I hope you will enjoy. So settle down, relax, and if you enjoy this story, please do hit that like button to help share this audiobook with others, and subscribe to get regular stories sent straight to your feed. Posy Parker's Halloween by Mrs. E.W. Latimer. Posy and Bob Parker of Baltimore went to visit their cousins in England. Posy, who was a little girl, was surprised to see the customs and observances supposed to belong in England to different days. On Michaelmas Day, September 29th, for instance, her uncle's family all dined upon roast goose, because Queen Elizabeth, having received at dinner news of the defeat of the Armada on that day, stuck her royal knife into the breast of a fat goose before her, and declared that thenceforward no Englishman should have good luck who did not eat goose upon St. Michael's Day. When Old Hallows Eve came on October 31st, the children and their cousins were invited to a beautiful old country place 5 miles across the Yorkshire moors to keep Halloween. "But what is Halloween kept for anyway, Uncle?" said little Posy as they rode over the moors that evening. "Really and truly, Posy, as you would say, the night of October 31st is the vigil of All Saints' Day, one of the 4 high festivals in the Roman Catholic Church, and a day on which all Christians who hold to ancient forms commemorate the noble doings of the holy dead. But the All Hallows frolics you will see this evening have nothing whatever to do with Christianity. They are relics of old paganism, of the days when millions of spiritual creatures were supposed to be allowed that night to walk the earth. Ghosts, fairy folk, witches, gnomes and brownies, all creatures of the fancy whose home is fairyland." "What is the proper thing to eat on Halloween, Uncle?" said Posy. "To eat, little Posy?" "Yes, Uncle. Every great occasion in England seems to me to have something proper to eat on that day." "Oh, now I understand you. Apples and nuts, Posy. A vigil was always a fast in the olden time, so those who kept Halloween could have no substantial dainties for their supper." "Nurse Birkenshaw used to call it Nutcrack Day," cried Posy's eldest cousin. "But here we are." They were ushered into a low, long room on the ground floor, paved with flagstones, having an immense hearth at one end. Inside the chimney, and on each side of the blazing fire built of logs and turf, were 2 oak benches, so that 6 guests could literally sit in the chimney corner. This recess was made beautiful by blue and white Dutch tiles. About 30 people soon assembled. From the ceiling hung a stick about 2 feet long and 5 feet from the floor. On one end of this stick was stuck an apple. To the other hung a small bag stuffed loosely with white sand. On one side of the room were 3 great washing tubs filled with water. 3 crocks stood on a side table, and baskets filled with apples, walnuts, chestnuts and fresh filberts were placed about the room. The performance began by reading Tam O'Shanter, accompanied by illustrations made by a magic lantern. When this was over and lights were again brought into the room, the tubs of water were drawn forward. 12 apples were set floating in each tub. 3 little boys had their arms pinioned, and waterproof capes were put over their clothes. Then each one was led up to a tub and told to name one of the girls present. If he could catch an apple in his teeth, she would be his next year's Valentine. Fun, splashing and laughter followed for 5 minutes. Then time was up, and 3 more boys took their turn. After many such trials, Posy's big cousin, an old hand with a big mouth, brought up a little apple. Another fellow caught an apple by its stalk, and Bob, good at a dive, after plunging his face to the bottom of the tub and holding his apple steady between his nose and chin, rose with it in his teeth, triumphant but dripping. After this had gone on for some time with varying success, the wet boys were sent off to change their clothes, and the girls' turn came. Many more apples were put into the tubs, and each girl in turn was told to hold a fork as high as she could in her right hand over the tub, and drop it on the apples. If she could spear one, She might choose her Valentine. The boys joined in this also, but hardly so many apples were speared as had been caught in the boys' teeth, and the victors in the tub fishery set up a shout of triumph. Next, boys and girls had their hands tied behind them and took turns to run up to the apple on the stick suspended by a string. This string had been twisted by the master of the revels, and the stick turned round rapidly. The fun was to jump up and with their teeth to seize the apple. If they missed, which of course they did nearly every time, the bag of sand swung round and hit them on the face, to the amusement of the company. Meantime there were many nuts roasting on the hearth, each named for a boy or girl. If one bearing a boy's name swelled up and popped away, his lady-love would lose him. If it flared up and blazed, he was thinking about her tenderly. If two nuts named for two lovers blazed at once, they would soon be a happy couple. Some of the older boys and girls of the party were then blindfolded, and hand in hand were conducted to the gate of the walled kitchen garden, where they were told to find their way into the cabbage patch, where each was to pull up a cabbage stump. When they returned with their prizes to the house, great fun and much dirt were the result. Posy's eldest cousin had brought in a big crooked cabbage stalk, with plenty of mould hanging to its roots. He was to marry a tall, stout, misshapen wife with a large fortune. Miss Clara, the young lady of the house, brought in a tall and slender stalk with little soil adhering to it. So by and by, as someone said, she would marry a tall, straight, penniless bridegroom. Then the table with the 3 crocks was brought into the middle of the room. Into one crock was poured fresh water, into another soapy water, and the third was empty. Posy, among the rest, was blindfolded and led up to the table. She was instructed to dip her fingers into one of the crocks. She felt around, and at last dipped into the one that held the soapy water. She was told that she would marry a widower. Miss Clara dipped into clear water and would marry a bachelor. One of the other girls put her fingers into the empty crock and would die an old maid. By this time it was nearly midnight, time for the fairy folk as well as children to be in bed. But Miss Clara first went upstairs to an empty room, and holding a candle in one hand, ate an apple before the looking-glass. Captain Strickland, slender and tall, crept softly upstairs after her. And as she ate her last mouthful, she saw his face over her shoulder. She dropped her candle, with a scream, and they came quietly down after a while in the dark together. Miss Clara's elder sister had meantime gone out into the flower garden, taking with her a ball of blue yarn. This she flung from her as far as possible, keeping hold, however, of one end and dragging it after her. As she went back to the house, she sang, "Who holds my thread? Who holds my clue? For he loves me and I him too." Suddenly the ball of yarn refused to follow her. She jerked at it in vain. She dared not let her clue break, because if she should lose the lover supposed to be holding its other end, she would die unmarried. "Let me see you," she cried eagerly, and a figure drew near her in the darkness. An arm covered with dark cloth was almost round her. She drew away with a scream and began to run, pursued by Bob, the young American, who had stolen away from the other guests to follow her, and whose appearance produced much laughter. For Bob was 12, and she was 27. The children had not cared much for these last 2 tests. They had been popping nuts and eating apples. They were now called to supper. There was at the end of a long table a great tureen of soured oatmeal porridge. The master of the house, who was of Scotch descent, called it sowens, and declared that everyone present must eat some with butter and salt if he desired to have luck till next All-Hallow Eve. There were other good things on the table, however, much better, Posy thought, than sour porridge. And when supper was over, the children went off to bed, solemnly assured by their elders that the fairy folk, the witches, ghosts, and so on, had already gone to their beds under the earth, not being permitted, even on such a night as Halloween, to sit up any longer. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you did, please do hit that like button to help share it with others. and check out my channel for more terrifying tales.